Hi, and welcome back to the Gluten-free RN podcast. I'm Nadine, the Gluten-free RN. Today, during episode 48, we're going to talk about gluten-free products. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Nadine, the Gluten-free RN, and today, during episode 48, we're going to talk about gluten-free products. This topic comes up quite a bit, and I did just get done talking at a few of the conferences, the gluten-free conferences, and we're always confronted or offered many products that you would think that since they are at a gluten-free conference, that they would in fact be gluten-free. So I want to review some things to think about. Please don't assume that a product that is listed as gluten-free or offered as gluten-free is in fact gluten-free or good for you. I had to go through this whole process myself when I was first diagnosed with celiac disease of cleaning out the cupboards meticulously and then replacing all of the products that I had always used ever since I was a kid and replacing them with products that were labeled gluten-free. What does gluten-free mean? I had to learn everything there was to know about being gluten-free, and that is a very steep learning curve. And I can tell you way back in 2006 when I found out there were not as many options, and of course many people way before me that were diagnosed had even fewer options. So are all of these options good for us? Are they the best things to help heal our intestines and our bodies? Well, let's talk about that. Because overall, we are perfectly capable of taking care of ourselves. We are very capable of making decisions, but we need information. We need the correct information so that we can make decisions that are the absolute best for our short-term and long-term health. And we have that conundrum of wanting to go out with family and friends and having a good time and enjoying ourselves, but also being afraid of being poisoned with gluten because nobody wants that. Our friends don't want it. Our families don't want it. And it can be difficult. And there are many times when we hear that many of the grains or different things are naturally gluten-free. Well, that's turning out to be maybe true and maybe not true. So we have to be aware of so many things on very many levels. Cross-contamination is a very real entity in our lives. So you have to be careful where you get your information from. Sometimes the places that we get our information from sounds like it's reputable and sounds like it's accurate. But the reality is that many of the celiac groups are actually taking money from corporations or pharmaceutical companies, which at that point taints the information that you may be getting. One of the things that prompted this whole discussion was that the Canadian Celiac Disease Association came out and said that Cheerios will no longer be labeled gluten-free. It's a voluntary removal of the gluten-free label on boxes of Cheerios. Because what they were finding is that they had over 55 Canadians complain that they were being sickened or that they were developing celiac symptoms after they were eating the Cheerios. Cheerios has voluntarily removed the gluten-free label from Cheerios in Canada until they are determined to be consistently gluten-free. Of course, there are a group of celiacs that may never be able to eat oats, either because of the cross-contamination or simply because they're a grain. There are many of us that can eat a few oats every once in a while, and as long as they're certified gluten-free, many people find that the oats themselves will cause signs or symptoms that are consistent with a gluten exposure. Of course, it's always recommended that newly diagnosed celiacs not eat oats at all, at least for the first 6 months to a year after they are newly diagnosed. And at that point, they can see if their body is tolerating the oats. Of course, the oats, if they are introduced, must be 100% gluten-free or tested to hopefully less than 20 parts per million and ideally less than 10 parts per million. There are many products that are labeled gluten removed, such as some of the beers. So I would highly recommend, especially newly diagnosed patients, please refrain from drinking any beers that claim to be gluten-free. And their special process that they use removes the gluten from their alcohol. We'll have an entire episode on gluten-free alcohols and gluten-free beers. There's an entire Facebook page devoted to people that have gotten sick by drinking gluten-removed beers. So you can go ahead and visit that Facebook page and get some information from people that are suffering after drinking what they supposed were gluten-free beers, but were actually gluten-reduced beers or special processed gluten-removed beers. I myself don't drink them and never have. We have access to beers that are 100% gluten-free. My favorites are Groundbreaker Brewing in Portland, Oregon. We're so lucky. And there are many, many other gluten-free breweries that are now opening and offering gluten-free beers. We do have to be careful, and it is very important that you have access to accurate information. And I did mention that some of the gluten-free groups around the country and certainly around the world are taking money from sponsors. And some of those sponsors are corporations that make gluten-free products. Whether they are truly gluten-free or not may be another topic. That's why we're talking today. So I myself, as the gluten-free RN, make it a practice never to accept any money or product from any corporation or group or anything. I'll try products and I'll test them if they're sent to me, and I'll give my honest review. But I do not allow any corporation or any group anywhere to give me money because that would taint the information that I give you. And certainly I want to make sure that the information I give to you is as accurate as I know it to be. So if I know that a person or several people or groups of people have complained about a product, I'm going to let you know. The reality is we knew Cheerios were not 100% gluten-free for a long time, and that the oats that they were using to make the Cheerios were pretty highly contaminated, and they were not testing them consistently to less than 20 parts per million, not by any stretch of the imagination. So if you're still eating what are labeled as gluten-free Cheerios, you may want to reconsider that. And when you're eating anything that is gluten-free, you always have to ask yourself, is this the most nutrient-dense foods that I can be eating, or is this a nutrient-deficient food that is going to either prevent me from getting better, or it's a cheap filler food that may just fill your belly, but your body is not actually deriving any nutrients from it at all? So those were all questions I had to ask myself early on. Are these foods actually helping me? Are they really gluten-free? And who am I trusting to make my food at this point? So over time, as I got my brain back, I started to ask more in-depth questions. What is a gluten-free product? Who is making that gluten-free product? Is it a designated gluten-free facility that is processing my food? Or are there other products that are being processed in that same facility that use wheat or dairy or soy or barley or anything that's going to cross-contaminate my food, depending on what my allergy is or my sensitivity? Where do these corporations source their ingredients from? Are their ingredients from a consistent source, or do they try to source the cheapest ingredient? Are they strict about batch testing each ingredient whenever it arrives into their facility? And by batch testing, what I mean is every time they get an ingredient, are they testing it before it is actually added as an ingredient into the product? Are you able to call the company or the corporation up and actually speak to a human being that, number one, knows how to spell gluten and celiac disease so that they can converse intelligently about this topic? Number two, can they answer correctly your very important questions about cross-contamination and testing? There is the all-important question of, is less than 20 parts per million enough for people with celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity? The concern with less than 20 parts per million is for people that are consuming many products that are just under the 20 part per million range. We've reviewed this before, but I think it's important enough that we're going to talk about it again. So if you're eating 3 products for breakfast that are less than 20 parts per million, but they happen to fall into the 15 to 18 parts per million range. So that's about 50 to 60 parts per million in your breakfast. And then you do the same for lunch, which then becomes higher parts per million. And then you do the same at dinner. So the parts per million are cumulative over the day. Believe it or not, that cumulative parts per million for gluten can cause people to continue to be sick. So GIG, or the Gluten Intolerance Group, has recommended that and been consistent about testing to less than 10 parts per million. And do keep in mind that the people without signs or symptoms with gluten exposure are not lucky, or this is my favorite, less sensitive, because the reality is the damage still happens on a very cellular level from that gluten exposure, and the villi are still being damaged. So is your immune system, and so is your nervous system. Some people get migraine headaches that they actually don't associate with a gluten exposure, but that's their neurological system getting hit with gluten. So it is very important to be aware that if you are eating several products that are labeled gluten-free over the course of the day, that cumulative effect can cause you to continue to be ill or have signs or symptoms consistent with celiac disease. When we find people in refractory celiac disease, which means that they're not getting better and their villi are not regenerating, what we find is that they have continued to have gluten exposure. And this is one way that can happen, is the cumulative effect. The good news is there are many reliable companies that are providing excellent gluten-free products, and they're very consistent. Some of the products that I have found that have been very consistent for people have been Enjoy Life, Glutino, Namaste, Pamela's. Pamela's does contain dairy. So when I gave up dairy several years ago, I had to take Pamela's products out of my cupboards because I realized I couldn't have dairy either. So you have to make that decision. Jill's crackers are amazing. Lundberg rice, the only thing that they use in their facility or process is rice. So there is no risk of cross-contamination. Of course, I'll let you know if that changes. But to my understanding, Lundberg rice is strictly processing rice in their facility. Mary's Gone Crackers has been consistently fabulous over the years, but they were recently bought. So I am watching very closely to see if the standards change or if there are any changes in the processing of the Mary's Gone Crackers. One of the new products that I really like are Kasabi crackers and flatbread. There's one ingredient, fresh yucca pulp, and it's a fabulous, very simple product. You can use it for flatbread and pizzas and many different appetizers. It's really just a decent product, not particularly nutrient dense. But if you're looking for something to serve other things on, like pesto or caviar or whatever it is that you're looking for, just something to serve an appetizer or something on, those Kasabi crackers are amazing and quite crunchy. And what I find is that many of us are missing that crunchiness or just a snack food. If you're looking for chips, my favorite, absolutely hands down, is Honest Jackson. Those chips are made with coconut oil and they are amazing. Their entire product line is really, really just quite good. And if I'm jonesing for a bag of chips or I just need a snack, that's the one I grab. Here in Salem, Oregon, we also have kettle chips. Kettle chips are potato chips and all kinds of other good chips to eat every once in a while. Believe it or not, I was in the Singapore airport, and the only thing I could find to eat in the entirety of the Singapore airport that was truly gluten-free were kettle chips. So I bought 3 bags, 3 of those little tiny bags, and that was what actually sustained me until I could get on the plane, where they did in fact have gluten-free, dairy-free food for me. But traveling can be dicey sometimes, and I was at the end of my trip coming home. I had run out of all of my travel food. So thankfully, those kettle chips were a good find in the Singapore airport. Of course, when we were talking about snack foods and everything, one of the things that people complain really decently about is the loss of convenience. They can't just go through a drive-through anymore. They have to think about the food wherever they go. What are they going to eat? Are they going to be okay? Are they going to be able to eat in a restaurant? And what are they going to do if they find out once they get in a restaurant that the food that was in fact delivered is gluten-free? It isn't. And then you have to decide whether you're going to eat that or not. I've had that happen more often than not sometimes, depending on where I am. I very carefully order my gluten-free food. I quiz the waiter. Sometimes I offer to talk to the chef or the manager so that they can make sure that the food is gluten-free. And then when I get the food delivered to the table, I always ask, is this food in fact gluten-free? This is a great last check, unless you have a NEMA sensor or an easy gluten test strip, because sometimes the server will look at the food and they'll look at me and they'll look back at the food and they'll go, you know what? It's not gluten-free. Okay, then take it back. So I understand about the convenience part. I understand about the feeling different and not being able to eat in certain restaurants or out at your favorite restaurant or your favorite foods anymore. But we really do have to take complete care of ourselves and take responsibility for that. And a lot of people do miss bread. That is another thing that the newly diagnosed are looking for. And they look for it quite fervently. Some people get into the hobby of making their own gluten-free bread, which I highly applaud, because then you have complete control over what goes in your bread, how you make it, and how it turns out, and what, it's to your liking. So you can put seeds in it or nuts or whatever it is that you like in your bread, and you can make it at home. There are many bread products out there. I do not buy them. I don't buy Udi's or Rudi's or any of the gluten-free breads. I don't buy Char's or any of the breads. I've gotten away from breads as a food vehicle. I think of them as cheap filler foods, and I choose to get my calories and my nutrients in vastly different places. And I'm certainly not going to rely on those companies to provide me with food that is consistently. I'm not going to rely on corporations or companies to provide me with breads or bread products that are substandard, or sometimes they really do just taste bad. I remember sending my daughter to school every day with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich way back when, and she was on a gluten-free diet with me at that point. And I sent her every day with these, what I thought were pretty decent gluten-free bread sandwiches, until I went on a field trip with my daughter and I took a bite of the sandwich that I had made for her and for me, and I promptly spit it out. And I looked at her and I said, "Do you eat these every day?" And she said, "Yes, Mommy, I eat these every day. You send them for me." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I will never send you with this type of sandwich again, ever." And we both laughed about it, but she was really quite good about it. And then I actually tried it, and it was not at all okay. So at that point, we had to have a big discussion about what her lunches look like, and we came up on a mutually agreed plan for packing her lunches every day. And what we did was we focused on nutrient-dense foods and snacks. We used fruits and veggies, and they were cut up in fun ways or different things that maybe the other kids didn't have, but the other kids actually wanted them. We got to try new fruits and veggies, which I encourage everyone to do. Unfortunately, most Americans, and I'm hoping this isn't the case in other countries, most Americans only eat about 17 fruits or vegetables. That's about it. So rotate those, try new things, and really just explore food options that you may not have looked at before. There are so many fruits and vegetables that are available, especially this time of year. And I think you need to really reevaluate the foods that you're eating. Are they nutrient dense? Are they going to help your body heal? Are they going to cause inflammation or get rid of it? There's also nuts and seeds, and some people just think there's peanuts, which I don't even recommend people eat anymore because of the risk of developing an allergy. It's one of the number one allergies we have to be concerned about, and that people carry EpiPens around for peanut exposures. So even for their safety, it's best that we avoid peanuts, but there's lots of other nuts. There's walnuts and cashews, almonds, Brazil nuts, hazelnuts or filberts, depending on what you want to call them. There's even jungle peanuts and tiger nuts, things I had never heard of before, but now I'm quite familiar with, and I like them. So after the initial shock of having to go gluten-free, what I've realized is that my taste buds have changed, and many of the things I thought I would never like, lima beans and Brussels sprouts, are now like candy. I cannot get enough of Brussels sprouts with bacon fat. Yum. Caramelized. It's so good and so good for me. Another good option are smoothies. Smoothies can be sent with kids in thermoses, and they really can be made to be nutrient dense and super good high fat with coconut milk or hemp milk. And then look to maybe make your potatoes more sweet potatoes or yams, which potatoes are great. They're a carbohydrate, but sweet potatoes and yams are high in beta carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A. So you want to make sure that your body has the tools and the nutrients available so that your body can actually utilize these foods that we're eating in order to work more efficiently and to stay healthy. Because if your intestines are healthy, then your body is able to fight off very common viruses, the cold virus, strep throat. Our immune system can actually work effectively if we're eating the right foods and our intestines are healed. Isn't that a great idea as we're coming into fall and winter? I also like the Applegate deli meats. They are labeled gluten-free and dairy-free or casein-free. Those are a great thing to pack into lunches or to use for hikes and field trips. You can just roll up the meat and eat it as is. You don't need any bread. Or you can wrap it in lettuce or collard greens. Lots of options. This allows us to get really creative with how we package food for our children in very simple ways. So wrapping meat in lettuce or kale makes it extremely nutrient dense and very colorful, actually. There's also Beeler's bacon and Hempler's bacon. It doesn't have to be hot. You can use it in sandwiches that you make with the lettuce wraps. So you can lettuce wrap the bacon and Applegate meats and tomatoes, pesto. Ooh, I'm just getting hungry talking about it. If you haven't tried roasted root vegetables, that was always one of my first favorites. So parsnips and roasted beets, carrots you can put in there. You can put anything roasted. And it's so simple just to cut up vegetables, parsnips, beets, potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams. The list goes on and on. Celeriac, a little bit of olive oil, put it on a cookie sheet that hasn't been used for regular gluten-containing anything, and a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, whatever other spices you want to put in there, and then roast them. 375, 400 degrees in your oven for as long as it takes to make them soft or slightly brown or definitely roasted. Again, tastes like candy. Food tastes great. Once your taste buds come back and you're really investigating and trying new foods, you're going to find that the things that you previously did not like now taste enormously better. We have been conditioned to like sugar and really bland food. So none of this is bland food. It actually has quite a bit of taste, especially if you're going to add something like pesto that you make yourself. And it is quite gratifying to go out to the garden and pick basil and garlic and actually make pesto at your house. I know I love it. Another really important thing to keep in mind is that corporations have 6 months to change the labels on the foods once they change the ingredients. So what that means is they can change the ingredients of a food product and they have 6 months to change the labels. So is the label actually reflective of the ingredients used to make that product? Once I found that out, I was like, oh, I just don't have the time to track all this down and to keep all of this in mind. So my use of products went way down. I just don't rely on products anymore as much as I used to. And I have very consistent rules that I like to shop by. So my products must have 5 ingredients or less, and I will fudge on that every once in a while. So I want the purest of whatever it is that I'm buying. I don't want added sugar. I don't want added anything, emulsifiers or natural ingredients that I don't know what they are or where they come from. And that's another rule, that if I cannot picture that ingredient, I can picture a cashew and a dried cranberry. I know what those look like, but I have no idea what hydrolyzed vegetable protein looks like, nor do I know where it comes from. And that's a way that corporations actually hide interesting ingredients in food products. That tells me that I don't want that product. It communicates very clearly to me that the corporation may be trying to sneak something in there that I don't want or need. So I want corporations to be extremely transparent about the ingredients that are in my products. I'm seeing more and more labels that say they are gluten-free or the product is gluten-free, but in fact it contains some form of wheat or actually contains barley. I don't understand how those products can be labeled gluten-free, but the reality is that manufacturers are not required to test products before they label them gluten-free. There seems to be a lot of confusion about what gluten-free is and what gluten-free is not. So do read labels if you're going to buy anything. And I've even seen things that have been labeled gluten-free, like kombucha. That was the big one. I saw a kombucha and I was traveling and I thought, oh, this is a local kombucha. I'm going to buy it. But I always flip it over just to look at the label, just to make sure that, the ingredients in there are what I suspect kombucha should be. And this particular kombucha, labeled gluten-free, had roasted barley in it. Who puts roasted barley in my kombucha? Bad idea. Another place I found roasted barley was in pesto. Again, a good way to ruin super good pesto. I don't buy that product. It's one of the reasons I make my own. I learned how. It's not that hard. Because more and more products are containing some variation of grains that I'm not interested in. And at this point, I am on my variation of a paleo type diet, where we avoid most grains, including rice and corn. However, at this point, I will have an ear of organic, local grown corn when it's in season, or I might have some rice with dinner if that's what's available. So there's lots of people that are newly diagnosed with celiac disease. They're trying to navigate this whole thing about labels and corporations and is this really gluten-free? They post up pictures on Instagram and Facebook and they are asking the community, are these products really gluten-free? I can't find anything on them that says it's not gluten-free, or is it gluten-free? Does anybody see any ingredients that would be concerning? Boy, that would take a lot of my time to actually do that for every product. If there's a question, I'm not going to buy that product. I've spent 10 years doing this, and many of the products that are labeled gluten-free or had been labeled gluten-free end up not, in fact, being gluten-free or testing to greater than 10 parts per million. So I decided that I was going to take it on for myself and for my own health, that I was going to avoid as many products as possible. Now, I know there's some really good products out there, and I stick with those very simple, basic products. Things from Enjoy Life or Glutino, Namaste if I need a baking mix. Jill's crackers are phenomenal. The Kasabi flatbread, Mary's Gone crackers. These are products that I have in my cupboard. None of them give me any product or pay me any money. So if you have products that you like, look through your cupboards and ask yourself, are they really gluten-free? Is there a chance that they're being contaminated? Are they just slightly less than 20 parts per million and may cause you to continue to be ill? So these are just questions that have to be answered, and these are things that need to be talked about. So I'm bringing up the topic because people get really antsy and defensive and don't like the foods that are labeled gluten-free to be questioned. They just want to eat them. Well, I'm going to say that they need to be questioned because we are relying on corporations or businesses to provide some of the food that we eat. And for those of us that have celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity or any food intolerance, we have to be our own advocate. We have to make sure that we are eating the best food for our body so that our bodies can heal and certainly heal from the organ damage that has occurred from wheat, barley, rye, and oats that we have been consuming for most of it or all of our lives. So in order to heal, we have to look at food as medicine. And food is medicine, not just for us, for everyone. And just because people don't know they have celiac disease, it doesn't mean that they aren't being affected by their food. And many people will find out that they do, in fact, have celiac disease. One of my favorite things is the more somebody gets defensive about their food or the more they get angry when they talk about celiac disease or gluten intolerance, the more I want them tested for celiac disease. So until people get tested for celiac disease and tested properly every year, because you can't be ruled out, especially if you're an HLA-DQ2 and or DQ8 gene carrier, these people really do need to be tested and tested appropriately. Mostly because it causes brain inflammation and hypoxia, difficulty thinking, brain fog. So if that's the case, then anybody that gets irritated by what you're eating or what I'm eating, they need to be tested for celiac disease too. We don't want to rule anybody out. So we covered a lot of information today about gluten-free products. Ask some questions, and now it's up to you to find the answers to the foods that you are using or buying. Look into them. Ask yourself if they're really helping you get better or if they're keeping you sick. It is really important that we have answers to these questions, not just for your health, but for the health of the community. Be aware of where you're getting your information from. Is it accurate? Can it change? This is all about your health and you getting better. So let's make sure that the information that we have as a community is transparent and the best information we can possibly get at this moment. This has been episode 48 of the Gluten-Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine Gruskowiak, the Gluten-Free RN. Thanks again for joining me. It's always a quest to get the best information and to make sure that you are asking really good questions so that you yourself and your families can be healthy for as long as humanly possible. Thanks again for joining me for episode 48. If you liked this episode or any of the preceding episodes, please take a few moments out of your busy day and go to iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or wherever you find the Gluten-Free RN podcast, and please rate it and leave a review. If you have any questions, there's ways to get a hold of me in the podcast notes. And if you look at the podcast notes, it helps other people find the Gluten-Free RN podcast. Thanks again for listening to episode 48. Until next time, bye.